Cimoooooooo.
Whether you're a new or returning player, or maybe you've played for a long time but your friends still think you suck, today I'm bringing to you 5 noob mistakes that you definitely want to avoid when it comes to the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Number 1. Not reading cards. I cannot tell you the amount of times I've witnessed player after player losing game after game, and sometimes in the most crucial of situations solely because they didn't read their cards. I'm guilty of this as well. I've had feature matches where I literally lost solely on the back of not just taking 3 seconds to read my opponent's cards, and that cost me getting a top cut finish at a specific YCS. So it happens to the best of us, but this is one of the biggest, most crucial mistakes you definitely have to learn from. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is such a complex game, and wording matters significantly. Wording in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is crucial, whether it's concerning if effects versus when effects, whether it's concerning a card that may have 2 or 3 different effects, because when it comes to a Yu-Gi-Oh! Card, that's rather common, and unless you know the exact wording on each of those effects verbatim, you might miss something, and that could be the reason that you win or lose a specific game. So many cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Restrict you to only special summoning certain types of cards, or special summoning only a finite amount of times after you've resolved a certain effect, or you can only use certain cards at certain opportunities, but it's those little nuances that if you're able to identify and take the full advantage of, that's where you're going to start seeing more success in your matches, and that's where you're going to start becoming a better player. Number 2, not remembering your own card effects. Now, this is technically an extension of not reading your own cards, but I like to classify this a little bit differently because time and time again, when players are playing out the majority of their turn, their mind is moving a million miles an hour, right? I mean, there's so many things that are going on. They're thinking about their own moves, how they're going to extend into further parts of their combo. They're thinking about what their opponent might have to stop them. And at times when you're performing these plays, let's say you're playing a deck like Burning Abyss, and after a Dante mill, maybe you milled a Skarm to the graveyard, and when your end phase rolls around, you forget to use that Skarm effect and miss out on a critical search of Tour Guide of the Underworld for your follow-up on your next turn. That could be the reason that you win or lose a particular game, and it is absolutely devastating once you realize midway through your opponent's turn, oh shit, I forgot to search for Skarm. Another prime example to illustrate this is Mech Knight Purple Nightfall. Now, Nightfall's a little bit different because it banishes itself, usually to protect itself, but obviously to also search another Mech Knight card. But as the player's going through playing their turn, they might be manipulating the banished pile, doing tons of other things, and then when their next standby phase rolls around, they may forget to bring that Purple Nightfall back. And this is even worse because this is a mandatory effect, and yeah, both players are responsible for remembering those types of effects, but ultimately the responsibility rests with you, and you need to remember this because if your opponent remembers and you don't, then they're not exactly inclined to get that Purple Nightfall back to the field. It's the unfortunate reality of the game that we play, but nonetheless, it's very important to remember these types of effects because when you're playing a game that you have to be managing all these different resource piles like your deck, your graveyard, your extra deck, your banished pile, you know, sometimes we just forget these types of things, but practice makes perfect, and the more you play with that deck, the more you're going to remember and make sure that you resolve all of your different effects. Number 3, checking the graveyard. I briefly mentioned the graveyard as a resource area, and it really is. The graveyard is almost an extension of your hand a lot of times. Some decks, it's almost like playing with 2 decks because you want to get as many cards into the graveyard as possible because that's where you're going to be conducting a majority of your actions. However, I cannot tell you the number of times I've seen players thinking that they have lethal lined up and they're about to OTK their opponent, but they neglect one important factor, and that is what could potentially be lurking in the opponent's graveyard. Graveyard tricks, especially quick effects that have been around for quite some time, is something you always need to be cognizant of because at any given moment, just when you think you're about to clutch victory, that could be a card that is your ultimate demise. Think about a card like Gizmek Orochi. This is a very, very dangerous card for the decks that do play it, such as Orcust and Gren Maju. You could have a perfect attack lined up, and when you're going in for that last hit, they could just banish those cards, summon that Gizmek, and they are still in that game. And if they're playing a deck like Gren Maju, all they have to do is top deck a Gren Maju, and they could just turn that game right around. Another great example example of this is Called by the Grave. Called by the Grave can banish an opponent's monster and negate that monster's effects for the remainder of the turn. And so if your opponent summons a monster with the same name as one that's already in their graveyard, this could be a way for you to get another negation in addition to what you already have set up, and maybe not even realize it, because Called by the Grave, while it's primarily used as hand trap interruption and maybe a DD Crow-esque effect, it can also just be a standard interruption in and of itself if the board sets itself up that way. Now, while managing your opponent's graveyard is important, it's probably equally, if not more important, to manage your own graveyard. Maybe you realize that there's a monster in your graveyard that can resurrect itself, making it so that you can go from that Link 3 to that Link 4 play, in that case getting you to something like Access Kotaka or Borosword Dragon, and that's just going to be a way for you to win in that turn. Graveyard management in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is essential, and that's why it's a noob mistake if you're not managing it. Number 4, giving away information. Now, players who have a lot of experience with other trading card games or other card games such as poker are going to understand the non-verbal cues and tells that really go into the psychological aspect of a game like this. And I think a lot of more novice to intermediate players may miss that this is something that's actually crucial to high-level Yu-Gi-Oh! Play. Let's say your opponent starts their turn by normal summoning a high-impact monster that you know is going to end them on a very reasonably sized board. So for this example, let's say something like Gyusu the Orcus Mech Knight or Scrap Recycler. Players who may be hesitant or maybe uncomfortable in their decision making may force their opponent to wait before resolving that effect because they want to use a hand trap that they have in their hand. However, this gives a lot of information away to the opponent, because if the opponent can identify that their opponent may not be as experienced or as skilled, they may be able to identify and correctly isolate what hand traps you may have in their hand. Do they have Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring? Do they have Effect Veiler? These high-level players are going to be making a mental list of all the potential cards that could disrupt their one normal summon, and then as they play throughout the rest of their turn, assuming that effect does resolve, they're going to be one by one checking off those cards in terms of what is allowed to resolve. This can be a little bit confusing because if the opponent doesn't know what exactly to stop, it makes it harder for the high-level player to play around it, since once you're at the highest levels of play, there are correct and incorrect places to use your certain negations. Now, when you get to the higher tiers of competitive play and have two high-tier players going against each other, both of these players are going to be playing different levels of mind games to try to psych the other player out. However, at a certain point, once the high-level player identifies that they've gotten past a certain point in the combo where, say, a card like Ash Blossom no longer matters, then they're going to most likely check that card off the list that their opponent doesn't have it in their hand. Otherwise, they would have used it much earlier on in the turn because it wouldn't make sense to allow the player to get that far. You can extrapolate this logic and apply it to a plethora of other instances. You can use this when it comes to your opponent checking their back row because maybe they're looking at one particular back row more often than another, and you know that based off of where they went to first after resolving a certain type of effect, that's the card you want to go after if you have something like a Twin Twister or Mystical Space Typhoon. Non-verbal information is almost as valuable, if not more valuable, than when it comes to actual public knowledge of what cards have been played. So for those reasons, this is a huge noob mistake that you definitely want to avoid. But that's going to bring us to my fifth and final noob mistake you definitely need to avoid: not utilizing all resources at your disposal. There is so much information available in so many different places to help you get better at playing Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, if you look at YouTube, there are tons of content creators pumping out loads of content for maybe your favorite deck, or maybe how the top tournaments are performing, or maybe some new cards that might be out on the horizon that you might need to look out for because they're going to have a huge impact on the competitive format. There are different levels of tournaments that get streamed across the internet on all different platforms that you can watch and observe players playing in action and be able to learn just by observing those players and maybe thinking for yourself, what would I have done in that situation if that were me? And this is the biggest one. If there is a single piece of information to take away from this video, it is don't be afraid to ask your opponents for advice. One of the fastest ways to get better as a player is to talk with your opponent after a match and ask them some questions. Ask maybe how you could have done better. Ask when you did a certain play if that was the correct play to do. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Community is filled with so many individuals who will happily help one another because at the end of the day, this game is very complicated and this community is very small, and so it's important that we can all band together and still help one another to help all of us grow together. So guys, that's going to do it for this video. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think, and be sure to leave down in the comments any other noob mistakes that you see people making that they can avoid in the future, so that this video can be a great resource for anyone who's looking to get into the game, return to the game, or maybe just stop sucking at the game as a whole. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.